So thank you for joining us for today's Act 1 of 2022 Frequently Asked Questions Surprise Part 1. So we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But today we're going to address a few of the basics, and we'll go through our agenda in just a moment. So, to introduce myself before I pass it over to my colleagues to say hello, my name is Ben Simmons. I am the Youth Development Specialist at the Center for Schools and Communities. I am also joined by my colleague Matt Butensky, who, in addition to working on Act One with us, is also the state's foster care point of contact. So you may recognize him from that. And I'm also joined by my colleague Megan Dale, who, in addition to her work on Act One, works significantly in our refugee education program. So lots of familiar faces to us that we see here in the audience. Now, I mentioned part one. We had sort of as we got into the content here for today, we realized that we wouldn't be doing a lot of these questions that came directly from practitioners, some of whom may be here with us. Um, we wanted to really give them some time to work through them, talk to them, or talk with you about them. So, this webinar will be the first part in a two-part series. Today, we're just going to address the basics of Act One, and then on Friday, the 6th of February, we'll be discussing a few more of the practical aspects of Act One of 2022. That being said, this is not necessarily the 101 side. We're just addressing what Act One is, eligibility questions, as well as concerns around school entity responsibility. So today will still be 60 minutes. You have joined us and registered, and therefore you are automatically registered for that session again on Friday, February 6th. If for some reason you're not able to attend that, it will also be recorded, and we will send out a separate registration just in case. Just so you know, we have a few success criteria here, just so you know what you're getting into today. Um, I've got them all listed right here, but in general, I'll allow you just to read through those details. We'll be addressing identification and eligibility criteria for students pertaining to Act 1 of 2022, as well as how to be flexible with documentation for those students. Additionally, we're going to discuss some of the specific responsibilities that school entities have according to Act 1 of 2022. We'll also be discussing common questions around fees and fee waivers. We're going to look at a few real world scenarios that are based on the questions that we've received as well. And finally, today, we're going to define what a school entity is and talk about duration of eligibility. So, kind of those core understandings. So, what is the Act 1 of 2022 FAQ, or frequently asked questions? This is a document that is the compilation of questions that have come through from individuals, like I said, who may be here with us or do the same kinds of work as you from around Pennsylvania. They're also based on some of ours and our colleagues at the Department of Education's questions or common answers to issues around implementing Act 1 of 2022. So these have all been sort of fielded, and we hope cover a lot of potential issues you may face. But this is a document that will be published on act1edinstability.org, so you can access that Anytime a question comes up around basic eligibility, or you just need somewhere to refer to. And today we're going to walk through each of the questions one by one. We'll produce just that FAQ, the frequently asked question, and then on the next slide, we're going to discuss the response and potentially go into a little more detail. You can also at any time raise your hand or drop a question in the chat around these, so we'll be happy to field those as well. Now, in addition to just the regular format of the FAQ, right, that would sound like a lot of us reading what you're looking at on the slide. And out of respect for your time and a little bit of compassion, we've also thrown in a few questions just to prime you going forward. This will also help us throughout the presentation to understand if we need to go a little farther into the content that's to come. We're going to have 4 instances. They're going to be released as Zoom polls. So they'll pop up there on your screen. But our first question is, which is not a common cause of education instability addressed by Act 1? So you should see that pop up for you. And like I said, this will get you ready for the session or the content to come. All right. So we have a fair few. It looks like the majority of us are, yes, correct, in identifying, I guess I should say, which is not a common cause. So truancy due to family preference, or in general, truancy would not be a common cause of education instability that is addressed by Act 1 of 2022. Truancy is also not listed, but what we are looking for are more involuntary school changes as a result from identification as experiencing homelessness, according to McKinney-Vento, foster care placement, and juvenile justice involvement. So that's just kind of how we're going to format those. If you have issues or we move a little too fast for you and you'd like to explore, just let us know. But next, I'm going to turn it over to Megan to let us know a little bit of the basics on Act 1.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. So let's first jump in with some general questions about Act 1 of 2022. In this section, we'll explore eligibility for Act 1 supports, the definition of education instability, and how Act 1 defines a school change. So first, the question is, what is Act 1 of 2022 and who does it support? Act 1 of 2022 was designed to disrupt negative outcomes associated with education instability, particularly by promoting timely graduation and equitable access to school and extracurriculars for eligible students. To counteract education instability, Act 1 is intended to ensure on-time graduation, provide equal access to academic and extracurricular activities, and remove certain systemic barriers for students who have experienced educational instability. And though there are numerous systemic issues that can impact a student's education journey, including those not listed here, the common causes of education instability that Act 1 recognizes include students experiencing homelessness, as defined by the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Act, a foster care placement, specifically court-appointed dependency, and juvenile justice involvement or alternative school placements. Namely, students who, under these circumstances, may have had their learning interrupted through changes in their school entity. And of note, Act 1 does not undermine the rights of students with disabilities or conflict with other state or federal laws. So let's jump into another question, another check your knowledge question. And this one is a scenario. And the question is Maria eligible? Maria is a 10th grader experiencing homelessness documented by your McKinney-Vento liaison. She remains enrolled at Lincoln Middle School throughout the school year. So take a look at the possible answers and decide, is Maria eligible for Act 1 of 2022? Okay. It looks like we are relatively torn between A and B. So the answer is no. Maria is not eligible for Act 1 supports. Act 1 requires two conditions to be met. One, a change in school entity enrollment in a single school year, and a qualifying circumstance. Maria is identified as homeless, which would be considered a qualifying circumstance, but she has not changed school entities. And again, Act 1 requires two conditions to be met, a qualifying circumstance and a change in school entity enrollment. Although she's ineligible, school staff can use their discretion and still consider using Act 1 inspired methods, such as a graduation plan, to support Maria's on-time graduation. So let's talk a bit further about Act 1 eligibility. So this question reads, how is education instability defined in Act 1 of 2022, and who is eligible to receive Act 1 protections? A student experiencing education instability is a student who has experienced one or more changes in a school entity during a single school year and is identified as one of the following qualifying circumstances listed here. Eligibility under Act 1 is two-pronged. Students must meet both conditions to be eligible for Act 1 protections.
Thank you, Megan. So good afternoon, everyone. We just reviewed carefully the students eligible under Act 1, but we are frequently asked, may school entities extend protections to other student groups? So let's take a look at that. And the answer to that is yes. School entities may extend certain protections defined in Act 1 to other student groups if they do not meet eligibility requirements. Act 1 really provides strategies that can help any student succeed. One example that we talk about frequently is extending graduation planning to students in foster care placement, regardless if they also change school entities, right? However, we do want to make a note that soliciting a prior school to issue a diploma or the Keystone diploma are only available to students who qualify for Act 1. So keep in mind that Act 1 provides a lot of best practices that can be extended to any student, but the protections around the Keystone diploma and soliciting a prior school are reserved for Act 1 eligible students. Okay, next question. Does changing schools mean changing school districts? And a change of school buildings alone within a district is not an eligible school change. Eligibility requires a transition between distinct educational entities. So we often refer to a change in AUN among school entities. So moving from one school district with one unique AUN to another school district with a unique AUN, or a charter school with a unique AUN, intermediate unit, etc. Act 1 applies to students regardless of whether they have returned to their former school, started at a new school, or re-engaged in school after an extended absence. And we have a few examples of what eligible school changes look like. So the first example is a student experiencing homelessness starts at a new school in a different school district because it is in their new attendance area. Another example is a student in foster care returns to their prior school after being enrolled in a host school district during a residential treatment facility placement. And another example is a student attends a private alternative education placement within another school entity and then returns to their prior school or a new school. So those are some examples, and that frequently asked question around changing schools and eligibility for Act 1. Another question on our FAQ is around cyber. So does a change in enrollment to a cyber charter school count as an eligible school change? And yes, cyber charter schools are unique school entities. If a student is enrolled into a cyber charter school as a result of education instability, it is an eligible school change. A school and change entity has occurred. However, keep in mind that a student participating in a cyber program within an entity at which they are currently enrolled is not an eligible school change. So once again, really going back to that change in school entity with different AUN numbers meets eligible school changes.
All right. And now together we're going to discuss how to identify students and common questions around identifying students, as well as how we can support Act 1 eligible students in very specific ways. Our first frequently asked question in this section is who is eligible to receive Act 1 protections? Well, as Megan had noted, this is a two-pronged identification. So you're looking for students where both of the following conditions are met. They have experienced one or more change in their school entity enrollment during a single school year, and they are identified as experiencing homelessness, a student in foster care placement, a student involved in the juvenile justice system, or a student receiving court-ordered services through a voluntary placement. And again, it's critical to note that students must meet both conditions in order to be eligible for Act 1 protections. Our next question is, what documentation is required to prove Act 1 eligibility? Well, specifically, none. Act 1 eligibility is based again on that two-prong criteria. And of course, there may be certain documentation pertaining to any of the other precipitating causes of education instability. But in general, we really ask that you are flexible with the sources and the formats of documentation around education records and other relevant documents, which may come from county children and youth agencies or other individuals within your LEA. So, an example that we've got here is a notification of foster care placement from a county children and youth agency to the LEA's foster care point of contact. In general, be sure to maintain confidentiality. So again, sticking to those FERPA requirements and not redisclosing without permission. If you have any questions around what documents are allowable, we can talk about that separately. But it's important to build strong connections with partners within your organization and the broader community, and ensure that the student's Act 1 eligibility is documented in the education record. This is important not only because it's mentioned specifically in Act 1 of 2022, but if a student experiences further education instability, this ensures that they'll maintain those protections for the duration it's allowable. And next, when a student has been deemed eligible for Act 1 protections, does the student have Act 1 protections for the remainder of their academic career? And this common question around the duration of services is a very valid one, and Act 1 does not specifically lie out the duration of services for students in grades K through 8. However, it's important to note that students in grades 9 through 12 do remain eligible for the entirety of their high school career. It's important also to note that those students should receive an individualized graduation plan that lays out their pathway to a timely graduation. And for those K to 8 students, while their identification won't follow them for the duration of their academic career, they are eligible to receive protections for the duration of their education instability and at least through the end of the current school year in which they've been identified.
Okay, and so we'll look at another specific eligibility question. Frequently, students who experience homelessness or are placed in foster care will remain in their school of origin with little or no missed time in school. Are these students eligible for Act One? And like our example with Maria earlier, the students described here are also not eligible. As we mentioned, a student's foster care or homeless status or identification alone is insufficient for Act One eligibility. The student must also change school entities one or more times during a single school year to be eligible for Act One. But again, as Matt mentioned, your school entity may decide to assist non-eligible students with certain benefits of Act One. So for example, your school entity may decide to develop a graduation plan for any student in foster care enrolled in your school entity. Now let's take a look at a question about the other necessary Act One qualifier, a change in school entity. Would a student qualify for Act One if they moved from a private school to a public school or vice versa? And the answer is no. A change in school enrollment must occur between two public school entities. And that is because private schools are not included in the definition of a school entity under the law. But again, your school can choose to apply Act One benefits on a case-by-case basis at your discretion for these specific types of school moves.
Okay, so now we are turning to frequently asked questions related to school entity responsibilities and implementation. So similarly to what Megan just mentioned, how does Act One define a school entity? So Megan already mentioned earlier that private schools are not included. So a school entity is defined as the following under Act One: a school district, a charter school, a cyber charter school, a regional charter school, an intermediate unit, or a career and technical school. And then keep in mind that clear change of school entity is required for Act One eligibility. All right, we have another quiz. So it's quiz time again. So right now we're looking at school responsibilities and the point of contact role at the school. So according to Act One, school entities must and select all that apply. So please review that list and we'll take a look at those quiz results in a moment. Just a couple more seconds. Great, so I see that most of you have taken the quiz. So let's see what we have here. We're a little bit everywhere on the answer board for this, but the answer is that all of these are responsibilities of school entities except that last one, which is provide transportation for all Act One students. So all school entities must develop clear policies and procedures for Act One implementation. They have to ensure equal access to programs, activities, and events, adopt policies regarding credit assessments and awards. They must establish a point of contact for every eligible student, and they must create individualized graduation plans for grades 9 through 12. And then finally, they also must waive fees that would otherwise be assessed against an Act One student. So regarding transportation, transportation is already provided by school entities, and there are special transportation protections for students eligible for McKinney-Vento and students in foster care placement. And we actually have an expanded transportation FAQ coming up.
All right. So as we've sort of started to explore under Act One of 2022, what are a school entity's responsibilities? So school entities are, of course, required to develop clear policies and procedures that ensure students experiencing education instability receive all benefits allowed through Act One of 2022. So that includes ensuring that students have equal access to educational programs, services, extracurricular activities, and other school-sponsored events that may be through the waiver of fees or just the removal of barriers to participation. School entities must also adopt policies regarding credit assessment. This is something that in greater detail we explore in our Act 1 of 2022 graduation planning and continue to look into. There's also a requirement that every Act 1 eligible student receives an established point of contact, just someone who they know they can go to with questions about their graduation planning, pathways to graduation, the services that they can receive, and how to waive certain fees. This is a requirement. However, it's not necessarily required that one individual is permanently the Act 1 of 2022 point of contact. If you're familiar, that might look similar to a McKinney-Vento homeless liaison or foster care point of contact. This can be a dynamic role that meets the student's needs and can change throughout time. There's also a requirement to create individualized graduation plans, again, for students in grades 9 through 12. This must also be show a student a clear pathway to graduation and assess their graduation progress at the time of enrollment or planned completion, and should be included in the student's education record, again, to benefit in the case of future education instability. So, what fees must school entities waive when a student is classified as Act 1? Well, the law requires that schools waive fees that would otherwise be assessed against a student. In practice, this may look like the school essentials, like a school ID, or replacement fees for a locker padlock, extracurricular fees like participation in athletics or clubs, as well as school trips. And in some cases, while transportation planning and arrangements are not a required fee to be waived for students, parking fees, or whether that's like a driver's ed course, anything that a student would otherwise be faced with. In general, we do want to note that this is not an exhaustive list. There are other potential fees that could be waived. In those instances, it's important to look at what category, according to this list, that might fall into, or if that is a fee that's otherwise assessed and is a barrier for that student experiencing education instability.
Okay, so let's take a look at this transportation related question. Are there transportation requirements for students eligible under Act 1? And like we learned from Matt earlier, the answer is no. Act 1 of 2022 does not establish specific transportation requirements for school entities, but many Act 1 eligible students might qualify for transportation related protections under other laws. Importantly, school entities should think about how transportation assistance might support equitable access and full participation for Act 1 eligible students. And of note, like Ben just described, transportation-related fees, such as parking permits, or if your school's driver education training is costly, those would both be examples of fees waived for Act 1 eligible students. So let's test your knowledge again about waived fees, specifically for extracurricular expenses. This is our last quiz question for the day. So your school has an Act 1 eligible 11th grader who has expressed interest in joining the volleyball team. Which of the following should be waived? And you can select all that you believe should be waived. Give everybody another minute or so. Okay, let's take a look at the answer. So as you can see, almost all of these fees should be waived. The only one not waived is the non-school sponsored sports league. This option would not apply as it does not support equitable access or full participation in school or school-sponsored activities, while the rest of these fees here do. So in addition to today's learning, we also wanted to share several resources for your use as you begin to sharpen your Act 1 of 2022 practices. So we have some listed here for you. So first we have the Act 1 overview training, which is another helpful video recording, much like this one, that can be a great tool for professional development and quick facts for implementing effective Act 1 policies in your LEA. We've also listed the language of the Act itself from January of 2022. Next is the Basic Education Circular, which was developed by the Pennsylvania Department of Education to give an overview of the Act 1 of 2022 policy and the obligations that LEAs have to engage students experiencing educational instability. Following that is the Keystone Diploma application, which is a resource that can be used in specific circumstances for students who meet the criteria. And for support or questions related to the Keystone Diploma, you can reach out to the first email listed below, the @pa.gov. Then, of course, we have a quick link to the Standards Aligned System, which will help with credit assessment. Also, a part of SAS are resources specific to Pennsylvania's high school graduation requirements. The following two resources are specific to supports for students with disabilities. So the PASA, as well as the statewide assessment performance and participation for students with disabilities link there. And then the last few links here are resources that our team at the Center for Schools and Communities developed in partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So we have our Act 1 of 2022 webpage, which is a great resource for all things Act 1. Included here, you'll find downloadable resources, links to the PA Department of Education's Act 1 materials, opportunities for further trainings, and any TA support that you might require from our team at the Center for Schools and Communities. And lastly, we have our link to the graduation plan toolkit, which was, again, a partnership developed in partnership with the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And we hope that you find it useful in your support as you start graduation planning with your Act 1 eligible students. And lastly, here are two email addresses that we encourage you to use on your Act 1 journey. So first, for anything related to the Keystone Diploma and general questions, you can reach out to the pa.gov email. And if you need to request any technical assistance or training, you can email the three of us at act1training@csc.csiu.org. And we've also included our individual emails here. Our team is always poised to assist you in your Act 1 of 2022 needs. So please reach out anytime, and thank you for joining us.